Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to this webinar series today, produced by the Dane County Executives Preventing Death from Despair Task Force and Safe Communities Madison, Dane County, with support from and broadcast by Fitchburg Access Community TV. I'm your host today, Carla Gaines, and I'm happy to be with you on this most important event that we have today and topic. I am pleased to convene this webinar series. To our knowledge, it's the only one of its kind in the nation. So on behalf of the Dane County Executives Ending Deaths from Despair Task Force, we thank you for joining us and for being part of the solution. This webinar series aims to save lives in Dane County, to help set a standard for communities around the nation grappling with deaths from despair, to understand what underlies these deaths from despair, from the perspective of people in pain, and to provide tools to help all that are working to prevent them. It also helps to lay the groundwork for continued conversation and action on how to make Dane County's mental health and substance abuse use disorder treatment systems accessible, culturally competent, and effective at eliminating all deaths from despair. Today's presentation of the series entitled Chronic Alcoholism and Poverty, presented by Dr. John Ewing from Meriter, Unity Point Health New Start, and UW Behavioral Health and Recovery, and Courtneys Story from Taxation Incorporated. Dr. John Ewing is an MD of addiction medicine. Dr. Ewing uses a neuroscience education treatment process intended to give patients a rationale for avoiding substance use and create an understanding of how medication, assisted treatment, and psychotherapy work. Along with Dr. Ewing today is our second presenter, Courtneys Story, the Homeless Services Program and Peer Advocates in Recovery Supervisor at Taxation Incorporated. Courtney utilizes her lived experiences with homelessness and mental health recovery, as well as her experience as an adult child of alcoholics, to shape her approach to advocating for housing as a human right. She oversees a dedicated team of providers with their own lived experiences in a street outreach program for people living in unsheltered locations, supportive housing programs for individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, and a team of certified peer specialists. She serves in a lived experience seat on the Homeless Service Consortium Board of Directors and chairs the Homeless Services Consortium, an outreach committee. And finally, with us today is Ernie Stutterfeld. As our moderator, Ernie is the CEO of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul Madison. He is also a member of the Ending Deaths from Despair Task Force and a former board member of Safe Communities. Thank you. And to our team of presenters today, take it away. I'm excited.
Thanks for joining me, everyone. I am super thankful for being invited to join this conversation. I'm hoping that my lived experiences with homelessness and being surrounded by alcohol abuse my whole life, and my current career of trying to end homelessness hopefully brings an interesting perspective to these conversations. So I wanted to start with explaining a little bit of my story. So Carol did a great job explaining where I work and kind of what programs I run. But my whole story is shaped by my parents' alcohol abuse while they raised me. So I'm actually originally from Ohio. So I'm from the eastern side of Ohio, right in that northern part of Appalachia. So it's a really interesting place. And it has a lot of poverty. So growing up, I was impacted by my parents' severe persistent mental illness, as well as their battles with addiction and alcoholism. So their symptoms and their up and down battles really created a life of instability and danger for me and my siblings. I wouldn't call the different homes and settings that I lived in, or different houses that we lived in, I wouldn't call them a home. We really raised ourselves and tried to parent my parents along the way. So I have really early memories of my mom going out to bars, coming home 1, 2 in the morning, and it really affecting my schedule for school, having to figure out how me and my siblings would get to school and have our education while my mom was starting to have her battles with alcohol. But it was considered so normal because it was just alcohol. It wasn't that bad. So my parents up and down battles with combined with their symptoms and the past trauma they had experienced really led to us moving around a lot. So we would move to fight evictions, we'd move for new partners that they had, we'd move for new jobs, and that led to like 9 elementary schools for us. But we learned to take on roles very early for the things my parents started to struggle with. So I was in charge of finances. I took that on early, and I'd budget our food share, the kind of the cash flow we had to figure out how to make our family work. But my parents' battles were difficult. So again, some of my early memories were of them drinking and fighting, and then that eventually led to binge drinking and abuse. Things got really tough for them because they did not have a lot of support. So they were trying to raise the 3 of us, and then eventually the 4 of us, but they did not have support for their illnesses. So when my parents were together, my biggest fears were actually who they associated with. So I would spend a lot of time in other people's homes and would be around a lot of binge drinking and fighting. People would come into our living spaces that I didn't trust. And eventually, one of the places we lived the longest, our trailer became uninhabitable and dangerous because of the different things their diseases were kind of bringing into our life. And that was the first time we were removed for foster care. So both my parents having similar struggles was really hard because they didn't actually have another partner to lean on either. It kind of fed into each other's drinking and lack of treatment. So eventually I didn't live with my dad anymore. Their drinking and fighting had led to a really messy divorce and lots of fighting over who got the kids. But neither of them were able to get treatment. And my dad began experiencing homelessness and then was eventually incarcerated. So once my parents split up, my fears became who moved into our homes instead of the people we were associated with, different men moving in and out that also struggled with various addictions. My dad eventually got a new family, and our lives continued to be controlled by alcohol, but there was still no hope and no treatment for either of them. So this continued for a long time. There didn't seem to be an out. So we started to try to help them fight this ourselves. So me and my siblings were no longer just the ones controlling our finances. I began stealing money from my mom's wallet and would hide it. I had this oatmeal container. So I would steal it so that she couldn't buy more alcohol, and I would budget that so that we could buy the things we needed in our family. I would find the spots where she hid her vodka and would dump them all down the drain. We had this wasteful cycle over and over again of, it felt like so much of our money, it was hard for us to have money, but then the amount of money we had, we'd have this battle on how it was spent. So I eventually ran away from my family. This was too much for me to handle, and I really gave up on their battles. So I'm happy to say that my dad eventually got sober. He was able to get some support and build really resilient relationships. His life isn't perfect, and he still has constant battles, and we're still not reconciled, but My mom's path looked a little different. So I had spent years watching her kind of wither away with the binging and dangerous relationships, and sat through so many suicide attempts because her life felt really hopeless to her. So she eventually got connected to a sponsor, and her sponsor was really radically supportive. And she did begin to pursue medication-assisted treatment, and she had various forms of therapy and had some success with supportive services, but the toll had really been taken on her body, and she did eventually pass away from some of her health battles. And my dad still needs a lot of help, and my mom was able to see a lot of hope at the end. So my experience has really shaped like who I wanted to be and what kind of battles I wanted to fight. So I'm really excited to be working with people struggling with various addictions and mental health concerns. And I've gotten to help a lot of people in my personal life that want connected to resources. And I think where I come from has just really shaped kind of where I'm going. So I don't think it's surprising when I say that there might be an issue with Wisconsin's culture around alcohol. I don't think that really shocks a lot of people. So growing up in Ohio, moved to Wisconsin, I thought it was going to be exactly the same. They're both in the Midwest, they have similar cultures. And I was still really shocked to find out when I got here how intense the marketing was, and all the billboards, all the commercials. The culture here is just shaped by like a pride for drinking. Some of the first things I was invited to when I moved here were brewery tours, drinking at different locations. Felt like I couldn't escape it. And I think there are some good things that can come from that kind of culture. So there's lots of jobs involved in that. It is like a local scene that many people take pride in, but it also really makes some concerning, dangerous atmospheres for people. So I was really shocked about that when I moved here because I thought it would be exactly the same. But you know most of those things if you're from Wisconsin. The reason I'm here today, other than kind of my background, is what I do for my job. So I work at Tellurian. We have a whole continuum of services that are intended to help people with recovery. So I run our homeless services programs, and so much of that is related to alcohol use. We don't actually have a lot of statistics on alcohol use and homelessness, and I'm often asked which thing leads to the other. I know Dr. Ewing will try to address that a little bit. The one thing that we do know is high rates of trauma. So people experiencing trauma that end up experiencing homelessness, the trauma that people have while they're experiencing homelessness. And we know that can cause a lot of need for coping. I try to highlight for people in conversations about addiction and homelessness that this is not a conversation about individual willpower. Rather, this is a conversation about broken systems and how to have creative solutions for fighting these kinds of issues. So we know that we have a lack of affordable housing, and we know we have a high rate of alcohol use and a high rate of people experiencing traumatic situations. And rather than focusing on conversations that say, why won't that person just make a different choice? Or really harmful conversations about maybe why it's someone's fault that they're in a certain situation. I try to focus on conversations that lead to solutions. So what can we do to address our housing issues? What can we do to provide recovery services? And how can we really have a culture, a new culture in our community that is trauma informed and creating lots of opportunity to find solutions for homelessness. So I specifically had mentioned I work in permanent supportive housing. So permanent supportive housing is a type of housing that would be considered housing first. So following the classic harm reduction approaches, but also saying that housing needs to be provided first instead of let's get somebody treatment first and then housing, or let's do this and then housing. That once someone has housing, it's more often easier to address something like alcohol use or other forms of addiction. And we see a lot of success with that. Once you have housing, you can take some of your crisis thought away, and you can have a safe place to sleep at night to then pursue what would it look like to get treatment. So it's indefinite leasing and has rental assistance. And then we also provide supportive services. So we find this model to be really successful. So most of our program participants at Tellurian have experienced, they all have experienced chronic homelessness. So very long length of homelessness with a disability, but many of them have experienced homelessness for a very long time. And often once they move into housing, we can start to have conversations of, not everyone has an alcohol use disorder, but if they do, what could we do to support you to treat that? Now that you have a safe place to sleep, what could we do to help you kind of set goals for different things you want to address? So we have 2 of those, and there are other agencies in Dane County that also provide that, and it's a nationwide model through HUD. So we find a lot of success with our program that's about 38 units. So that I also oversee street outreach programming, where we are able to provide services to people who are unsheltered, that might be experiencing mental health concerns and or substance use. So finding people where they are rather than expecting them to come to us is a model that we find successful. That's how we can help someone fight homelessness, is if we meet them where they are and then connect them to resources. So my focus for today was to really highlight that it's worth the fight. It's worth us addressing recovery needs and homelessness concerns. It's worth addressing expensive housing and the unknowns we have about the connection of homelessness and alcohol use. We have people like Dr. Ewing that are doing the really great work to study these things. We have Meriters programs, we have Tellurian's programs, the list could go on. We're taking the right steps, and even this webinar series is one of those, to kind of expose the problem and create a space where people can ask questions. So many of you watching might be professionals, might be policymakers, or you might be somebody who has friends and families struggling with alcohol, or yourself have had a battle with alcohol use or homelessness. And I think this place to discuss it is amazing. It's not happening a lot of places, like Carol mentioned, and this is kind of where we start to do that work. So I'm really proud to be a part of it. Ernie, that's kind of really what I had for my first thoughts before we get to questions later.
One of the things that's interesting is just how sparse information is about the homeless and alcohol use disorder. Good. So what we have here is the classic chicken and egg problem. We wonder, okay, does problematic alcohol use cause poverty, or does poverty cause problematic alcohol use? And really, going through the available literature, a lot of it's confusing and contradictory. And what we find is that only about a quarter of the first-time homeless have an alcohol use disorder. And this is about twice the rate of the general population. So this means that most of our first-time homeless people do not have an alcohol use disorder. We can imagine, though, that there is a sorting process and that people who become homeless, particularly if they have an alcohol use disorder, are more likely to have homelessness over and over again. And so when we think about homelessness, we think about the chronically homeless. And yes, most of them do have a substance use disorder. And many of them have serious mental illness. So the other thing that we know, and this is actually a kind of a curious finding, is that people that are in the lower fifth of income, that is, the people that are in the lowest quintile of income, are 5 times more likely to become ill or die from their alcohol use. And we're not exactly sure why that is. We do know that a lot of it has to do with stress. When we look at stress biomarkers, we have markers that can tell us just how much stress this person has had. We can actually see changes in their DNA. And there's a minority stress measure that can be pretty intense. So people that are in a minority, a racial minority, or perhaps some other rare or less mainstream aspect, they are much more likely to experience stress. And we know that stress and alcohol use disorders go together. And Courtney pointed out that there's a huge amount of advertising about alcohol use here in Wisconsin. And very often, alcohol use is presented as normal. It's like, oh, this is what you do when you're an adult. Well, actually, most people don't drink. So there's almost a little teeny tiny bit of information about these sensible drinking guidelines. And the main point here is to avoid daily use. It is not normal to drink alcohol every day. And in fact, this is very often the gateway to adapting to chronic alcohol use or adapting to alcohol use such that you have a lot of post-use dysphoria and actual withdrawal symptoms. And the other thing is, what is heavy drinking? A lot of people don't realize that heavy drinking is 3 or 4 drinks per session. That is actually heavy drinking. So here in Wisconsin, there's a lot of misperceptions about what is normal. So this sensible drinking guideline is actually strongly protective, and this consists of no more than 2 to 3 drinks per day for women or 3 to 4 per men. And you have to note that this is heavy drinking. And then 2 alcohol-free days after heavy drinking. And continuing to drink at this upper level, and again, this is the heavy drinking, is not advised. And there is definite strong evidence that daily drinking is harmful. And then we also know that some groups, such as pregnant women and those operating dangerous equipment like automobiles or airplanes should drink less or nothing at all. So, a whole lot of people drink above these recommended guidelines. And the 2 patterns most likely to lead to harm are binge drinking or chronic daily drinking. So binge drinking is anything more than 4. And chronic drinking is to drink daily or to drink regularly. And so it turns out that, that's not actually normal. So at risk, more than 7 drinks per week and more than 3 drinks per episode. So there are some additional safety measures that it would be great if the public knew, and that is never on an empty stomach, don't start before dark, never more than 1 drink per hour or 3 per day, and never daily or more than twice weekly. And if you observe these guidelines, you'll be unlikely to encounter problems from alcohol, or less likely. So, when you look at this scale as to how much do people drink, you can see in this graphic that actually most people basically don't drink. So we'll try to get a little better picture here. Hopefully you can see the right-hand side. And you can see that, in order to get up to 2 drinks per week, you're up in the 7th decile. And then it shoots up from there, and the top 10%, you see an average of about 10 drinks or more per day. So this reflects the adaptation to repeated alcohol use, where people have rebound anxiety and insomnia and depression when they don't have their alcohol. And this is what starts to happen when people start to think that daily drinking is normal. So again, we're back to this chicken and egg problem. Does minority stress and poverty, the stress of poverty, cause alcohol use disorder? And there is evidence that yes, that certainly does occur. And then there's this other question: does poverty cause problematic alcohol use? And the answer is that yes. The stress markers that we see in people that have poverty or minority stress, that makes them much more inclined to drink in a problematic fashion. And then there's a kind of a hint in the literature that the poor drink less, but those poor who drink have a lot more harm. So it's interesting that people that are in the lowest quintile of income, many of them drink less than the general population. But there are a few that drink daily, and it leads to harm. So again, the basic findings is that in the first-time homeless, only about 1/4 have an alcohol use disorder. And this is twice the rate of the general population. And so people in the lowest fifth of income, if they have an alcohol use disorder, they're 5 times more likely to become ill or die from their alcohol use disorder. So that concludes the slideshow here. And so I'm interested to find out what kind of questions people might have.
And Cheryl, I believe you'll send some questions from the chat, but I have a few, John and Courtney, to start with, that whoever feels most comfortable in addressing initially may. But I'm wondering, many people might think that there's no way to keep people housed if you're an alcoholic. But what are the means of helping people stay housed if they're struggling with alcoholism?
I think that might be a question in my zone. Dr. Ewing, feel free to pitch in as well. But yeah, alcoholism is tough, and it destroys a lot of different parts of people's lives. But at the same time, for that kind of question, I would say that we look at each person on their skills. So we do have people that alcohol leads to eviction, and alcohol leads to really negative life outcomes. That's why we have this task force talking about deaths from despair. But we also have a lot of success stories. So I'll use my small permanent supportive housing program as a kind of like a case study. We have some people that have jobs, that have meaningful relationships, in their lives, who manage their money well to whatever standard you would define that as, but for what they would define as well and what I would define as well, that battle alcohol use. And then we have some that don't. So my main goals and many permanent supportive housing programs would be to help them keep their housing and help encourage their treatment without forcing those services. So it's a lot of supportive case management often. So having a safe place for someone to live, pointing them to the resources that exist and fighting for those resources to have proper funding, and then connecting them with workers and support systems that can help them navigate that. So sometimes that's a supportive case manager that's more in depth with their life. Sometimes that's a certified peer specialist who has maybe gone through their own battle with recovery that can come alongside them to offer creative solutions. Sometimes it's more intensive programs, but in the end, having the safe housing and the resources together, we see it work. People can stay housed and get help when the options are there.
Thank you, Courtney. Dr. Ewing, did you want to pitch on that one, or?
Yes. So it's really interesting when you look at how people adapt to alcohol and then they go through acute alcohol withdrawal. Many people need assistance, but can get through acute alcohol withdrawal. It's the post-acute withdrawal that sinks the ship. Basically, what happens is that alcohol slows down your brain, and your brain adapts by going faster. And so it's experiencing increased stress. People are more susceptible to stress. Things that can help with stress is housing, nutrition, and social support. And unfortunately, when people are homeless, the social support that they turn to is often their peers, which may be using substances. So getting people embedded in an environment where they have good support, where they have a job, where they are hanging out with people that are not involved in using substances, and getting them to where they can get through that post-acute withdrawal, that critical 3 to 4 months of abstinence that it takes for their brain to normalize. Oftentimes we think that people with substance use disorders they're trying to have fun and they're cheating. And really what happens is that when people are intoxicated, the frontal lobes are suppressed. So the frontal lobes is where we make our plans. And when the frontal lobe is suppressed, we become reactive and we often act without thinking. So all our plans go out the window. Likewise, when we're in withdrawal or when we encounter severe stress, then the frontal lobes are suppressed. And once again, our plans go out the window. So in many cases, trying to expect people to just hang on with willpower is an exercise in futility. And it's actually somewhat cruel to expect people to control themselves when they don't have the capacity to do so. So yeah, I agree that giving them a long enough support and a healthy enough environment to get through that post-acute withdrawal and stabilize is critical.
Thank you. We have a pair of questions from the chat that are linked, and it's, what connections do you see between chronic alcoholism and depression, and how are treatments for them interrelated? And then how can loved ones be supportive when someone is struggling?
Yeah. So one of the things that we see with all of the substances of abuse is that they trigger the release of dopamine, which is that sort of, oh, I feel lucky moment. For example, when you come across an unexpected opportunity, you get that little surge of joy, and that's produced by a surge of dopamine. And people quit thinking about it and grab that cookie or that candy or whatever it is. So that same mechanism is how these substances of abuse operate. And so whenever you use something that gets you high, it triggers the release of dopamine, but then the brain and body reacts to that by inhibiting the release of dopamine. And so when the substance leaves your body, then the dopamine level is low, and then people lack motivation. So they lack motivation, and this is experienced as depression, as a post-use dysphoria. So getting people to stop doing the thing that is making their depression worse is often step one. So all of the substances of abuse trigger the release of dopamine. The brain and body reacts by starting to inhibit dopamine release, and it does that with a substance called dynorphin. And dynorphin also goes up during times of stress, and this makes it more likely that people will act without thinking and relapse back to their substance use. So the number one treatment is to get people to stop using substances of abuse. And then many people, they do have difficult circumstances. They have trauma, they have anxiety. And all of these are strong risk factors for developing a substance use disorder. So some of the more effective treatments that we have are behavioral interventions with psychotherapy. We also do have medications that can help with depression and to a certain extent with anxiety. So I think being supportive and connecting with the person rather than their disease is what your loved ones want to do. There was a tough love movement where, you just kick them out and you quit talking to them until they quit using. And this rarely works. This is rarely effective. And unfortunately, sometimes it leads to tragedy.
Thank you, Dr. Ewing. Courtney, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks, Dr. Ewing, for that perspective. I could sit and listen to you all day. I don't need to talk. It's just really encouraging to hear kind of your research and background in this. And I would agree, the tough love conversations still happen a lot. And there is a time and a place where family and friends have to make certain decisions, but as a whole, providing support, providing protective, resilient relationships and safe living environments, and connecting people to resources, even if you're printing them out or calling an agency to see if they can get a case manager. You don't have to social work your own friends and family, can be really impactful on their recovery, to just kind of show them as much love and support as possible.
Another important aspect of communicating with your loved one is timing. When the person is intoxicated, they're not going to be in a frame of mind to really hear you. What's going to be happening is that the frontal lobe is suppressed and you're talking to the brainstem. And the brainstem is that kind of inner animal, that inner toddler that isn't actually that much fun to talk to. And then during states of withdrawal, the frontal lobe is also suppressed. And again, people are emotionally reactive, they're anxious, they're irritable. And I would rather speak to the cortex and speak to that person rather than interacting with their brainstem. So a lot of times when loved ones encounter a frustrating episode with one of their loved ones that's using substances, it doesn't really help to become reactive and to further activate their brainstem because you're just not going to get anywhere. So the overpowering them with will and anger oftentimes is ineffective. What's happened is that people have followed a map to get where they are. They followed a map believing that this is the solution to their problems and that this is how you have fun. And so I think it's more effective to give them a better map about how to have fun and how to make your sadness go away without using substances.
Moving for a moment from the care and concern of people close in to those who are struggling on this basis, maybe you can address what you think may be some of the most important public policy steps that we could take that are most likely to reduce both poverty and chronic alcoholism or any linkage between them. Thoughts about that?
One of the things that has had an effect is taxation on alcohol. There is some risk that some government programs become dependent on these taxes, but making the alcohol or the cigarettes more expensive makes it a little less likely that young people will get a hold of it. And the younger people are when they start, the more likely they are to develop a substance use disorder. So the expense is one of the things that we can go after. The other is that we just don't have effective public information about what is at-risk drinking, what are sensible guidelines. You just don't find it compared to all of these displays of the use of alcohol in the media. So we're just kind of overwhelmed by these messages that are actually kind of toxic. And then the other thing is we need much better support for treatment programs. People need more than just a few days in the hospital. They need more than 30 days of residential rehab. They often need a good 6 or even 12 months. And so helping to build policies that support these programs is vital. It's very important.
Yeah, that's my neck of the woods, Dr. Ewing. Yeah, that's my fight is being from the nonprofit behavioral health world. We need more money, and not always more money, but yeah, more funding for programs. So the amount of detox beds, the type of detox programs Medicaid will pay for, the length of residential treatment, like Dr. Ewing referenced, all of those things combined together to impact the types of support someone can get, but also the types of relief someone can have when they're pursuing treatment. So if going to detox will lead you to lose your job or not have childcare, how do you bounce back from that if you don't have any protective measures?
One analogy would be that supposing that somebody comes in with a broken leg, and so I give them a cast and I say, okay, you can use this for 3 to 7 days and then you have to give it back. And so the short time in treatment that we sometimes allow is equivalent to that sort of a process. And it's actually almost cruel. Somebody had their hands up.
Carla?
Yes. I just wanted to first, this topic is very dear to me also. Courtney, thank you for sharing in this space and with all of those that are watching this webinar. Like you, my mother experienced alcoholism throughout my younger years up until possibly almost my second year in high school. And when Dr. Ewing talked about pain, I remember, and this is always stuck in my brain, I cannot get it out. When I was about 9 years old, my mother was so drunk that unfortunately we were on the highway in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago, and I literally had to get over to the wheel to move the car over to the side of the road. Every time I go back home to Chicago, I remember that spot under the viaduct, under that bridge. I remember it like it was just yesterday. And I didn't really understand it until I really got older. My mother, thank God, she went into AA. She was a spokesman for Alcoholics Anonymous. She was a national speaker across, the nation, and really dived into it deep. But I didn't understand. It was because I had a sister that was older than me, and she died of leukemia when she was 8. And so experiencing that pain that you talked about, Dr. Ewing, is that piece that I can understand is why that led her to that piece of alcoholism, right? And I share with my family this all the time, the stories, because it can be hereditary, and that we have to be careful as a family of drinking, of consuming alcohol. And Courtney, to be honest, to this day, I can't even stand the smell of alcohol. I can smell it so, like I can pick it up like that. And so I just wanted to just kind of share my story. I thank God that my mom, she lived to be 97 years old and worked for Alcoholics Anonymous until she was 94. And so she answered the phone and she would say, Alcoholics Anonymous, this is Nellie speaking. And so she was there to help people. And so, Courtney, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story, and Dr. Ewing, and Ernie for just bringing us on. And I just wanted you encourage me. And so because we're survivors. We're survivors. So I just wanted to share. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Carol, because I think that's the hope of what can happen. Is there's nothing special about my story. It's just my story. But you have a story, and many others have a story. And if we kind of gather in places to share those, then we can have these conversations that hope to lead to solutions. So, I mean, this, but I'll remind you, it wasn't your job to have to drive her safely. But we're glad you did it. It wasn't my job to have to raise my parents, but it's the effects of these battles. And Dr. Ewing, I wanted to touch on something you said earlier about the pain as well. So I think that's a really forgotten piece of what we're talking about. Is so much of the conversations are how to fix it, why it happened, but it's also horrifying. It's happening, and it's killing people, and it's ruining lives. And I try to summarize all my views on addiction and poverty and so forth on truly believing that if we know how the brain works and how trauma works and all these things, that an individual with addiction is doing their best, is choosing the best solution they have with the skills that they have, and that we can add more skills. We can create more solutions to help with other options.
Courtney, both you and Carla shared aspects of lived experience, and thank you for that. You broached the prospect of growing up with an alcoholic parent or parents. We often hear about poverty among some people grappling with it as being a generational problem in families. How big a factor do you think alcoholism is in generational poverty?
Yeah, I think I don't have the immediate statistics or anything for that, but we see it happen. We know Dr. Ewing has lots of knowledge on the effects of the brain on that, but we see it happen when people grow up. And the types of adverse experiences you've had, the types of things you've seen, but also the types of options you've been given. So whether you had a resilient person or whether you were given different opportunities can really impact your life outcome. But not everyone gets those. So if you are growing up with poverty and alcoholism, and no one intercedes, what's your outcome going to be? So if you're given the opportunities for education, income, healthcare, the list goes on and on, that can change your trajectory. So again, this task force, lots of the great things we have going on in Dane County can change lives, children, youth, adults. It's not too late for adults to get help and change. Harder, but it's not too late. So I appreciate that question, and it's just interceding instead of just letting it go with no help.
Maintaining contact and cultivating resilience. It's like a self-eating donut that the stress from poverty and minority stress leads to substance use disorders. And then as we adapt to substance use, it increases our stress reactivity. And then it contributes to more poverty and more substance use. And the ramp off is resilience and having that social connectedness, the compassionate, caring connection with others that can provide you with an alternative. So thank you very much for putting this webinar together.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for having me. Tellurian, the Homeless Services Consortium, Dane County's Coalition for Recovery, we're all trying to fight this battle together with continuing conversations like these. And Carla, I think I've called you Carol this whole time. I'm really sorry.
It's all right. It's okay. It's about our stories and our narratives and hopefully helping someone today be encouraged.
Amen. And I want to thank Courtney Spears and Dr. John Ewing and Carla for all the insight you've shared today on a really crucial set of interrelated issues. And it's much appreciated. And I'm sure that not only the folks listening now, but people who will listen into this recorded webinar later will find the information and experience you've shared very useful. Really appreciate it. Thank you much. We're at about our limit of time, so I've got 15 more questions that are way too complex to tackle in 27 seconds. So in any case, thanks all for taking part in and listening in on this webinar. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ernie, for your moderation. You did a great job. Thank you, Dr. John, for your insightful information and science. And Courtney, again, thank you for sharing your narrative, your story, your lived experience, and all of your work that you're doing. Thank you so much. Have a great day, all.
Thank you.